This is Alex Bryant. Thank you very much for attending today's webinar about reconfiguring global supply chain footprints, successfully managing diversification in Mexico, Central Eastern Europe, and Southeast Asia. I want to thank Dan McLeod and Mark Plum with East West Associates. I want to thank Harris Pricken, Dan Harris, and Fred Rockefeller for giving this presentation. Here is how we're going to work today's agenda. We're going to do a brief introduction for East West, a brief introduction for Harris Pricken. We're going to look briefly at the current situation, current supply chain, global supply chain situation, what's the current report now, and what's causing a lot of this diversification beyond China. So many companies are in the process of looking to diversify their global manufacturing and their global supply chain beyond China. We're going to look at briefly why that's the case and what effect it's having. And then in part 4, we're going to have a brief discussion of the effect of the supply chain diversification, what it's having on Chinese suppliers, what some of the background of the supply chain base in Southeast Asia, Mexico, and Central Eastern Europe, and then what's the effect it's having on companies that have China procurement offices. We'll then in part 5 cover the legal issues. Part 4, 1 through 5, that will take us about 30 minutes. And then we've got part 6 discussion, that will be 30 minutes. So the key issue here today is the success of this webinar is going to be based on how many questions we get from the audience and make this really a roundtable discussion, roundtable conversation. Just a few housekeeping items. If you have questions, you can ask questions. We'll answer questions throughout the webinar. Click on the button that says questions and we'll ask it. We'll ask all the questions. We do have a hard stop at 3 o'clock Eastern. We won't keep you beyond that. So if all the questions are not answered, we'll get back to you directly and respond directly to you. So here are the first first 5, 6 steps. I will first introduce for the East-West side. I will briefly go through it. I want to introduce Dan McLeod and Mark Plum. Dan, if you can give a brief background, and Mark, if you can give a brief background.
Okay, this is Dan McLeod. Thanks, Alex. My background is primarily manufacturing operations management, also management of capital projects and execution. Spent 21 years in Asia, about 13 of that in China, but 7 years also living in Southeast Asia, managing operations there throughout the region. Been with East West Associates for the last 4 years, and since then, worked with them both projects, worked with East West both projects in Asia, but also in Mexico and Central and Eastern Europe. Mark?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So yeah, this is Mark Plum. I had over I guess 25, 30 years, my whole working career in Asia. I come at it from a general business background. Started out in Thailand, Indochina in 90 to 95, and then really moved up to China and lived in China until 2014. As my last assignment, I was president of a company called Briggs and Stratton, where we had to handle all the manufacturing, sales, distribution, marketing. So really have a focus on Asia strong, and as Asia's developed and China's developed, it's spread even a little bit to Eastern Europe now. So pretty much a Asia China guy for 30, 40 years. Thanks.
Great, Mark. Dan, thank you very much. So here's a brief background on East West. We're going to keep this clean so we can get to the discussion part, but East West, we've got people that reside in 5 markets: US, China, Southeast Asia, Mexico, Central Eastern Europe. We've got on the ground people in all those 5 regions and countries. All the people that work for East West all have one qualification. They had to have a senior management position with P&L responsibilities to run a Western company on the ground in that country, in China, in Southeast Asia, in Mexico, and in Central Eastern Europe. And just list a few: Briggs & Stratton, Bechtel, Ashland, just a couple of examples. But all the people had to have P&L responsibilities. So as a result of that time they spent running operations, most people we have are local nationals in each of those regions, in Central Eastern Europe, Mexico, Southeast Asia, and China. Mostly local nationals, but all of them meet that same requirement. They have P&L responsibilities to running a Western company there. So our clients are leaning us for supply chain and operational solutions, which is everything regarding the factory, everything regarding supply chain, identifying qualifying suppliers. They're leaning us to commercial side, which is growing the top line, and leaning into us for risk management, which is not as relevant here in the US, but quite relevant in the other markets where we play in. And that's a group we have of ex-policemen, ex-military, who do a lot of background checks for us on suppliers and new employees, fraud investigations. And we've got a brief listing there of our different services, different industry sectors where we operate. Here is where the East-West is located in these 5 regions. I wanted just to point this out that obviously a lot of what's happening here that's going on is being driven by what's going on in China, right? And the whole point of today's webinar was about reconfiguring supply chain. And we know that obviously over the last couple of years, it's intensified, but companies have been trying to diversify their supply chain for a number of years out of China. But really in the last 3 to 4 years, there's been a much heated growth on that. A lot of either the boards are saying that the too heavily dependent on the executives are coming forward and saying that too heavily dependent on China, both for their global manufacturing footprint, both for the global supply chain footprint. So companies are trying to diversify beyond China for their supply chain. And there's where we're operating in Southeast Asia, Central Eastern Europe, and Mexico. That's what we'll cover. But you've seen, as a result of that, we'll get into a little bit around the suppliers, because these suppliers in Southeast Asia, Central Eastern Europe, Mexico are getting called on and getting requests they haven't gotten in the past years, and they are growing substantially. It's also affecting the Chinese who are trying to diversify beyond China. So even though this map, we're operating in those 5 regions, a lot of this is being driven by really what's going on the ground in China. At this point, let me turn it over to Dan Harris. Dan, if you give a brief introduction of Harris Bricken.
Sure, thanks, Alex. So Harris Bricken is a law firm made up of about 35 lawyers. Nearly half are fluent in Chinese, and roughly the same number are fluent in Spanish. Fred Rocafort, who will be doing the bulk of the talking for us today, is actually fluent in both of those languages. We have lawyers in the United States, China, Mexico, and Brazil, and our lead lawyer in Mexico is also fluent in both Spanish and Chinese, and of course English as well. Our firm does all sorts of international work, but our focus is on intellectual property and manufacturing, because both of those things are essentially inherently international. And for at least the last decade or so, we have been drafting 5 to 10 manufacturing contracts every month in multiple countries around the world.
Thank you, Fred. I think we're having trouble with Fred. Is
just
on the audio.
no, sorry about that. I was going to rely on Dan to introduce me, but no, just as Dan mentioned, I am fluent in Chinese, and that's a reflection of the fact that I spent over a decade in country, first as a foreign service officer and then working in the private sector. So much of what I'll share with you today is the result of that direct experience. Thank you, Alex.
Great, thank you so much. All right, so now we're going to turn over to part 3, which is really going to be looking at the current global supply chain and what's going on, how we got here, what exactly is occurring, and then how that's affecting companies going forward. So let me turn over to Mark Plum. Mark, if you would take it from here.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Alex. Yeah. So what's really gone on recently with the global supply chain? And we'll talk, specifically about China and the current state. And a lot of us that have been on this call know a lot of this has happened. Raw materials and component pricing have been increasing in China, of course. And then the last 3 years, of course, we have the China tariffs. For those who've been around China have known that last 10 years, labor rates have been increasing. And they're top down, as you people know, you guys know. It's the government says this year it's going to be 12%, 10%. It's down to around 6-7%. But we had several years in 2008, 9, 10, 11, 12 that were 12-13% a year. A recent phenomenon has been container costs coming out of the ports. Shanghai to LA has gone from roughly $3,500 to close to $10,000, and in conjunction with that, Of course, the lead times, the delays, can be up to 3-4 weeks on both the port side and the destination side. Now, we think that's gonna work itself through that log jam here in the next 12 to 18 months, but it's still how it does ever get back to $3,500 a container is probably doubtful. So a lot of boards, a lot of senior VPs, are worried about overdependence on China. A lot of us, to be quite frank, went to China 20, 25 years ago. Labor rates were, half, they were 20, you could save 30, 40% on your products. You could basically ship them anywhere in the world, and that savings of cost made up for any freight costs or time on the water. Well, that's of course certainly changed, as we all know. And then, so kind of a new phenomenon, not a new phenomenon, the large auto companies have done it for years, is regional diversification for strategies for sourcing. In other words, maybe build and source closer to your consumption, and we'll talk about that. Supply chain, it has been occurring again. China's been, some of the China suppliers have been moving out of China as for the last 10, 15 years. The motorcycle guys out of Chongqing started moving to Vietnam 10, 12 years ago. But it's really speeded up in the last few years, the intensity. And it's affected, of course, where do you go? It's by sector, it's by customers, it's by market. Now, after saying all this, if you're in China and your consumption is China and you're selling in China and your brands are in China, then you're there, and you just have to continue to work hard to improve your business. Next slide, please, Alex. So, yeah, kind of a little bit of what's happened in 12 years. We all went to China. Costs were cheap. They started to rise. Then they started getting a little more restrictive on regulatory and complexity, sometimes even to protect local guys. The increased domestic competition, well, how that happened? Well, quite frankly, a lot of them copied what we were building there to begin with. Then China began to slow down, and so you got a slower market with more competition and rising costs. Then, of course, a 2025 initiative, President Xi is really a bit of a nationalist and really promoting local consumption. Okay, fine. Next bullet, please, Alex. And then, of course, starting in 2017, we had the tariffs and stuff coming back to the States, had an additional 25% cost on it, and still does for that matter. And then now COVID, and COVID is really affected how we run businesses, because no one can go there, they can't come here. You're really kind of stuck now on what's going on, and that's not just a China phenomenon, but we hope that's gonna ease up here. Next slide, please, Alex. So, what are the reasons? I mean, what's the primary issues of what's going on? Well, first, which countries are the right locations to establish non-Chinese supply chains, and why, right? So you got to decide, one, I think I got to move. Now I got to say, well, where am I going to move to, and why am I going to move there? So getting to that regional diversification, kind of a quick cut at it is a lot of people that are having stuff made in China and bringing it back to the States. Mexico is really a logical choice, and particularly if you're in the bigger, bulkier stuff. If you're in, appliances, auto component parts, tier 1 kind of stuff, air conditionings, that sort of stuff. That's China. I mean, Mexico makes a lot of sense for the American markets. Southeast Asia, if you're in China and your markets are a lot in Southeast Asia, or even in China, staying in Asia is good. And we'll talk about countries like Thailand and Vietnam that we like a lot. In addition, though, Thailand and Vietnam, depending on what you're making, and if the freight costs and you have high value, low bulk items, you can still make. And I'm thinking of electronics. Still do a lot of electronic work in Thailand and in Vietnam, and bring those back to the States, because so much of it's airshipped, and your bulk, your container loads are tremendous. And then, of course, Central Eastern Europe for the European market. Again, a lot of companies went to China. They were so competitive on cost that they could their markets were Western Europe. They could ship it all the way across and still land it and be competitive. Again, that's changed. And Central Eastern Europe now is really a tremendous place and opportunity to manufacture, not only for Central Eastern Europe, but for Western Europe. So those are those three regions we like a lot. The primary issues are, how do you, there's evaluate your supply chain footprint. What can you do in all the countries to avoid tariffs? Okay, fine. You look at Thailand, for example. Thailand's got a 150-year treaty, the Treaty of Amity, where by contract you don't have the issues with tariffs, and they can't put new stuff on based on the tariff. You may want to get closer to your customers. You want to shorten your lead time, lessen your logistics costs. You don't have money tied up on the water, et cetera, et cetera. So those are some of the reasons of why why you may want to reestablish your supply chains, and then these are kind of some areas where you may want to establish them. Alex, you want to pick up on the next slide, please?
Sure. So we've covered parts 1 through 3, and we've kind of covered how we got here, what the current situation is here. The purpose of this webinar is around reconfiguring it. So in order to make this discussion relevant, we wanted to just briefly cover, with all the supply chain diversification, trying to go from China, looking at Southeast Asia, looking at Mexico, looking at Central Eastern Europe, we wanted just to share a couple pieces of information to help in the discussion. One is how this diversification is affecting current Chinese suppliers now, because we've all been dealing with suppliers, how it is affecting them. Secondly, we're going to briefly look at industry sectors and export markets in Southeast Asia, Mexico, and Central Eastern Europe, so everyone kind of understands where these countries are best focused when you're looking at exports, because these countries, they're not going to replace China. So where are they, where, if you've got a certain product, where should you be looking? And then thirdly, looking at U.S. companies and Western companies that have China procurement offices. That situation has changed. So we're going to briefly look at that. Then we'll get the legal issues and then the discussion. So if we're looking at specifically Chinese suppliers, what is going on with them? The Chinese suppliers right now there are a couple of things going on. One, they've actively been trying to relocate, as Mark pointed out, the case of Chinese motorcycles they've been relocating for 10 years. But you've seen a lot of Chinese companies look in Southeast Asia, particularly obviously in Vietnam, because of the ethnicity connection and the governmental connections there. That's been going on for a while. You've obviously got certain sectors within a certain sector like furniture and textiles. They've obviously been relocating to China. So a lot of these suppliers are getting into Southeast Asia, looking heavily at Vietnam. There's significant relocation to Mexico over the last 3 years. In fact, now in Monterey, there's a business park dedicated just to Chinese companies operating on the ground in Mexico in order to service the U.S. market. So some of the larger companies there that are operating there, they're hired, put in facility, but the Chinese have actively in the last 3-4 years looking at Mexico. They've got this individual business park and they've been growing significantly. And that's their way of getting around the tariffs. And lastly, they've been over the last 4 years really going into North Africa. It's part of their One Belt, One Road policy. It's also a way for them to inexpensively service the European market and also serve their governmental needs. So there's active relocation on behalf of the Chinese and encouraged by the government to do that. For those suppliers in China, we're also seeing that there's some of them are having some financial difficulties. Some of them are going through insolvencies or having financial difficulties, which their customers probably don't know that, but we're seeing that. And we're seeing cases where people get into trouble by working with the supplier and the supplier having financial difficulties. We're also seeing increased claims by Western firms, Western customers who are buying from some of the Chinese suppliers that because the suppliers are struggling, that they are now taking to buying orders from companies over there, from their shortcutting some of the quality control standards to increase their margins. So that's kind of the situation on the ground for a lot of the Chinese suppliers that are operating. I'm now going to turn over to Mark Plum and ask Mark if he would discuss some of the regional supply chain bases in Central Eastern Europe, and then Dan will look at Mexico and Southeast Asia.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Alex. So as I mentioned, with diversification of supply bases closer to consumption, I'm going to talk a little bit about Central Eastern Europe as it pertains to selling within Central Eastern Europe and probably more importantly, Western Europe. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of companies went to China, built in China, and then put stuff on the water for 6, 7, 8 weeks. And then it made sense. It worked because it was so inexpensive. That's changed. So we like the Visegrad countries. We like them a lot, actually. Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia. Poland, it was really kind of the manufacturing basket for many, many years for Russia, particularly in the armament business. So great manufacturers as it pertains to steel, to heavy products, to that sort of thing, appliances, et cetera, et cetera. Hungary, good autos. The Germans have been in there heavy with Volkswagen and Audi for years. Slovakia, probably it's the most competitive cost-wise. So, and again, you have more of some of the appliances, some of the heavy metal guys, a little bit of the tier 2, 3 auto guys. And then, of course, Czech Republic, closest to Germany, further along the development stage, little higher labor rates, more sophisticated products. But all these countries, with what the EU has done with them now in the freeway system, where in the old days, if you're in China, you're 7 weeks on the water, your orders are tied up, you can't change them. If you're in Poland now, or in Poland and you're in Krakow, where we just have some friends of ours building some things, you can be in Berlin in 4 or 5 hours on the A4 freeway. The Poland, Czech Republic, southern border of northern Poland, Silesia Moravian region, again, phenomenal area to be producing and shipping to Western Europe. So all in all, if your markets are Europe and Western Europe, then the Silesia Moravian region is quite good. You can see here, where they ship to. Well, Germany, of course, is kind of, the big guy in Western Europe. So all those countries, their number one markets are export markets are, Germany. But if you just look at this chart a little bit, you'll see that, France, Italy, UK, all those are great export markets from Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, and Slovakia. So if Europe and Western Europe is your markets for consumption, this is a good area to really take a look at. I'm going to turn it over to Dan McLeod. Dan's going to talk a little bit about Vietnam and Southeast Asia.
Yeah. So thanks, Mark. Talk for a minute about Southeast Asia, and it's a large area, a lot of countries, a lot of cultures. But from a manufacturing environment, where we see the most activity is really Vietnam and Thailand. So we'll focus on those two areas. And a tremendous amount of growth in the last few years in Vietnam from a relatively low base. And the big change there is upgraded technology. Still, labor costs are competitive. 5-10 years ago, it was mostly a labor play. Now it's more of a diverse manufacturing sector. So what started with the garment industry, the shoe industry, is morphed into furniture, and now more recently, high labor content industries like electronics manufacturing, whether it's phones or computers. And then over the last couple of years, is the tariff situation. Vietnam's got favorable trade relationships with the U.S. So manufacturers have migrated south and set up operations there. And again, I mentioned the tech giants, Apple and others, which have relocated to the northern part of the country. Key industries, a diverse manufacturing base, anywhere from, can you go back? Yeah, anywhere from textiles to computers, and starting with steel now. One thing to consider, though, is still the manufacturing base is very reliant upon China for key inputs. We mentioned the electronics industry has grown tremendously. It's generally in the north near Hanoi, and that is so they can maintain access by truck to southern China for key components. So still reliant, still doesn't have the manufacturing base of China, so still reliant on China for key imports. Thailand, a little different. Thailand's the second largest economy in Southeast Asia. It has had a significant manufacturing economy since at least the 80s. And really appliance manufacturers, large petrochemical and chemical sector there. And then more recently, the electronics sector. And it tends to be concentrated in the Eastern Economic Corridor, just southeast of Bangkok. And more recently has developed as a logistics hub. Seaports, airports particularly have grown around that area so that not only can supply to the rest of ASEAN, Southeast Asia, export to Europe and the US, but also increasingly connectivity with India and South Asia. So it's really from a supply chain, supply standpoint, distribution standpoint, it's the best proximity to the entire Asia Pacific, Southeast Asia region. Key manufacturing, automobiles. It's the largest automotive sector in Southeast Asia, supplying to the entire region. Electronics has been well established. Computers, as I mentioned earlier, chemical sector, petrochemical sector is well established. And Mark had mentioned earlier some of the trade relationships between Thailand and the U.S. And you see the U.S. is the primary export destination out of Thailand. Next slide, please, Alex. And then shifting a bit towards Mexico. And we talked, 10, 15, 20 years ago when manufacturers were moving from into China, looking at lower costs. Well, that equation has slipped substantially. In general, inflation rates in Mexico have been much more lower and moderate than we've seen in China. So now that typical employment costs are as much as 20% lower. Industrial property lease costs are much more competitive, and obviously transportation costs they were 70% lower, and now it's the spike in container costs, container movement costs have really increased that. And then generally lower utility costs, and particularly natural gas. And for companies that are natural gas users or are needed in their process, that's been an issue in China for a number of years. And Mexico is much more favorable in utility prices. Top manufacturing industries, aerospace is very well established. Automotive, certainly, by far the largest industry for export into the U.S. market, but also into the growing Mexico and other Latin American markets. Medical devices is rather new, tends to be concentrated on the northern and northwest border. Electronics, it really split into two main areas: consumer electronics, whether it's televisions, computers, telephones, but also electronics industry to supply industrial customers. So a major supplier into automotive, aerospace, appliance industry. So, and then more recently, electronic manufacturing services, contract manufacturing services for large international electronics companies are moving into Guadalajara in particular, which is a big part of the industry. And then appliance manufacturing and furnishing, which has been well established over the years. We'll talk a little bit about procurement offices, because that's a place that many U.S. companies have invested in China for the last 20 years, setting up a situation there. So this, as you imagine, this has caused some heartburn and chaos in those operations, and companies are struggling to manage that. And we're seeing some downsizing in that, because as companies look to diversify their supply chains, their supplier base outside of China, there's less need for those offices that companies have spent a lot of years to develop. So it's a challenge to maintain morale, but it's also employee termination in China can be a challenge, and we'll probably address that a bit in the conversation later on today. You've made investments in people and systems that are now underutilized. In companies, we're finding companies that are struggling to replicate this in other regions, and particularly in Vietnam, where a lot of activity is, it's hard to find, companies are struggling to find the people with the technical and managerial skills to really uproot and move those operations to a lower cost country. Next slide, please, Alex. So I'm going to turn this over to Fred Rocafort, who's going to talk about some of the key legal issues associated with what we're seeing in the region. Fred?
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. As you can see from this title slide and this slide as well, we're going to be focusing on intellectual property. This is really the key issue going forward as a company prepares for a China departure. Once a company indicates that it is going to be leaving China or reducing its presence there, there's going to be a scramble for its IP, and not only the actual trademarks, copyright, but more broadly that reputation that has been developed over the years, there is going to be a lot less, if any, incentive to be nice on the part of local suppliers and business partners. And the risks of counterfeiting are not going to be reduced simply because a company is heading to a different destination. Quite the opposite. And it is critical that you have the means to enforce your IP as you exit China. Otherwise, there is your company is not going to have any recourse in the case that it finds its products being counterfeited. The Chinese authorities are not going to be enforcing any unregistered rights. So this is really a central issue to deal with as a China exit strategy is developed. And this includes making contingencies for remote enforcement of IP rights, which obviously presents some complications as opposed to doing so if you are in country. We cannot lose sight of the fact that this departure will be taking place in the context of worsening U.S.-China relations, and that certainly creates additional complexities that perhaps were not there 5-10 years ago when companies were already beginning to relocate some of their production. Next slide, please. So one issue, and this has to do with intellectual property, but also with any other kind of dispute that a company might be facing in China, avoid hostage situations. The greatest leverage that an irate business partner or soon to be former employee or regulatory authority in China could have over a company that is getting ready to depart from China is to have an individual, an executive member of staff that cannot leave China. So in order to avoid giving away that leverage, be very, very careful of any travel to China as once the departure is announced or once it starts becoming obvious that there's going to be that departure. And of course, you have to guard against opportunistic and or retaliatory actions by suppliers and staff, including, of course, seizures of property and attempts to utilize the good name of the company to produce counterfeits and so on. Next slide, please. So as soon as a company begins to consider a China departure, it must put forth a strategy that is not only clear and addresses all of the important issues, but also is realistic in terms of timelines and in terms of what can be done. To come up with a strategy that counts on being able to solve all key issues within a matter of months might not cut it. There are certain issues that, in order to deal with them properly, you're going to need time. You're going to need to think through how you do things. So, for example, a practical example: things like molds and tooling, you want to get those out of China before a departure is announced, but also the way in which you do so might be critical. So, for example, if instructions are given to local China staff to start packing up equipment to send it to Vietnam, that's obviously going to show the company's hand. Might be more advisable to plan on a different exit strategy that involves sending that equipment to a destination that doesn't raise any suspicions, with perhaps the intention of eventually getting it to a new operation. But as should be obvious, this takes time. Again, intellectual property is key to all this. Make sure the intellectual property is registered so that in the future, if there is any problem, any counterfeiting is taking place, the company has the ability to go to the authorities in China and say, we have a problem and we have a legal right to protect this particular IP, do something about it. Make sure that existing registrations are up to date. It's really easy for registrations to lapse over time without the companies really being aware of it. The initial 10-year registration period can seem like a very long period of time when the registration is obtained, but that does go by pretty quickly. Next slide. So again, just repeating what I just said. Make sure everything is up to date. Any registrations that have not been taken care of, do that right away. You do not want to be doing this after the fact when you have already left China and the problems that departure brings are manifesting themselves. Also, in addition to the intellectual property registrations, customs recordals are key. Just as in the US, this is a separate process related to but different from the registrations, and it essentially indicates to the law enforcement agency in question, in this case China Customs, that you have a counterfeiting problem or concerns, and that you're willing to help to work with them to get those cases solved. And that is essential. Obviously, no law enforcement agency in the world wants to waste its time on matters that will not be resolved and will not go into their win column. Next slide, please. Handling intellectual property protection from afar, it obviously presents some complications, especially for companies that have been handling these matters in-house. So, for example, there might be an employee that works with customs, works with other law enforcement agencies, is on hand to go and examine products if there is a seizure of suspected counterfeits. Obviously, if operations in China are drawn down, then an alternative must be found. This is the good news is that the alternatives exist, but of course you will not want to retain anyone in a hurry. You'll want to make sure that you're engaging the right providers, and of course law firms like us, for example, are in a good position to help with that. Next slide. Well, and that's the end of my presentation. Any questions, I'll be glad to field those. Thank you very much.
All right, Fred, thank you so much. And now we've got about 20 minutes worth of questions for the roundtable discussion. I know one just popped in. Some of the question was, what exactly do I need to do to register my IP with China Customs, and why am I doing that if I'm leaving? Apparently, the company worked for is appliance manufacturer. And
well, sure. The reason for registering the IP generally is to make sure that you have a recourse if there is counterfeiting. Without an IP registration, then there's nothing that can be done legally. Customs recordal will serve as a complement to that by indicating to China Customs that they need to be on the lookout for counterfeits of a particular product, of a particular brand. It's a relatively straightforward process. Once you have that IP registered, it's not complex. It's something we do all the time.
We had another question popped up that says the gentleman asked, if you move your sourcing to a Chinese company that has relocated to Vietnam, isn't your supply chain still vulnerable to the Chinese political interference? Anyone
Okay.
to take that one?
This is Dan Harris talking. Yes, it most certainly is, because every Chinese company is in some way or another controlled by the CCP. However, it is a Chinese company in a place like Vietnam or even Mexico is going to be a lot freer from CCP control than if it's in China. And that's one of the reasons it's there. And also it's going to be less likely to be hit by political headwinds coming from the United States, like tariffs. I've always found it very interesting that the US puts tariffs on Chinese companies in China, but doesn't typically put tariffs on Chinese companies in Mexico or Vietnam, because technically Chinese companies in Mexico are Mexican companies, Chinese companies in Vietnam are Vietnamese companies. But yeah, there are still going to be political risks.
All right, thank you. That's one of the questions popped up. Another question popped up, just, this is an electronics firm, I guess they're an electronic supplier. It says, I'm sourcing heavily in China. What is the process for evaluating Southeast Asia versus Mexico versus Central Eastern Europe? If I've got to diversify my supply chain, I'm sourcing heavily from China. What is my process for evaluating those three markets? Maybe Mark or Dan?
Well, yeah, this is Mark Plum. So, if you obviously you want to be looking at the labor expertise, where they are, what's their history, what's their record, who else do they sell to, where are you consuming it at? As we talked earlier, if you're bringing it back to the States, Mexico, it looks very good, but if it's a high value, low volume product, and you can airship a lot, then Southeast Asia offers a lot of opportunities based on very, very aggressive tax incentives, corporate income tax relief on a lot of stuff, as long as you're bringing high value products there. So you really got it starts, I believe, where is it being consumed, and then you work backwards as to labor, as to taxes, as to supply chain, how long in the water or in the air, so that really drives it.
All right. We've got this more question popped up. One was, what percentage of the raw materials in Southeast Asian countries are imported from China? And how will this affect, and how will this affect Section 301 country of origin determination? For example, raw material, raw glass from China with a mirror manufacturing silvering process performed in Vietnam. So the question is, what percentage of raw materials, say in Vietnam or Thailand, are imported from China? And obviously that's going to depend on industry sector, and how will this affect Section 301 country of origin determinations?
Let me jump in. This is Fred. This is really a case-to-case question. It will vary, right? There is no formula that is used to determine whether a product is made in China or made in a place like Vietnam. And not only that, the case law that impacts these determinations is evolving. So if you look at how CBP has looked at this over the years, it has changed. The key concept is, some of the audience might be familiar with it. The key concept is that of significant transformation. But again, that is really a term of art, and can vary. If you're talking about a real raw input, if you will, right? If you're taking something like sugar out of country A and then turning it into candy in sugar B, then that's clearly a different product. But it does start getting more complex with things like furniture, things like appliances, and CBP and presumably other customs agencies around the world sometimes do take odd positions in terms of whether a product has been transformed. To the layman, it might seem like it's a totally different thing than what came from China. But as far as these agencies are concerned, they might say no. It's its essential character was already imparted when that product left China. So it's really and it is of course something to take into account when planning out the manufacturing flow, because it could come down to a particular step in the manufacturing process, that if you do it in the second country as opposed to doing it in China, that's what gets your product treated as a product from that country as opposed to one from China.
I would definitely agree with you. It certainly does. It's got to be part of the global manufacturing strategy, part of your global supply chain strategy. Absolutely. We had another question pop up. Can you comment on the current political situation in China, the situation in the South China Sea, the Uyghurs, etc.? Do you see relationships between China and the West deteriorating, stabilizing, or improving?
Wow,
So
this is embarrassing. That's a lot of questions. I'm just going to say that our law firm went on record way back in 2018 saying that the fight between the United States and China was the new normal and would only get worse and would only expand. And by expand, we have consistently been saying that we expect the EU to get tougher with China, and it is very much starting to do so. So in terms of the future, I would say we are at the best point now, and I don't see it getting better within the next 2 to 3 years. It may get worse. And as for more specifics, I'll let others answer.
Mark,
Certainly,
Dan,
I mean, certainly your comment about the EU becoming more engaged in this is we're hearing and seeing the same things, and that shift is palpable. And basically, people we talk to think that until or unless there's a change in leadership at the top of the Chinese government, that it's going to continue on the same trajectory that it's been. Certainly, there was talk before change of administration in the U.S. whether Biden administration would take a different turn, but even before the inauguration, my sources were telling me that wasn't going to happen. There wasn't any interest in the Biden administration for changing the track that it's on, at least not certainly before the midterm elections. And my guess is it's going to continue. And so, yeah, I'd agree, Fred. It's going to continue on a downward trajectory for the near future.
another question popped in. Says Thailand, Vietnam, Mexico. Can you comment on how these countries, and even Eastern Europe, can possibly duplicate the total productive capacity of China? Isn't China 2 to 5 times higher overall capacity?
Absolutely.
Yeah, let me,
Go ahead.
yeah, just real quick, this is Mark Plum. So yeah, China has put in tremendous infrastructure over the last, 20, 25 years. So from a volume standpoint, you're not going to beat China. Now, as far as having really the same opportunities on a smaller scale that was done in China, Thailand, for example, replicates that very, very well. What's made in China is made in Thailand. What's sourced in China is sourced in Thailand. And then now with the labor rates in Thailand being half of what China was, and with the tax incentives and the land incentives and the employment incentives, you can replicate about everything you do in China, you could do in Thailand and do it much more competitively, except if it pushes up against huge volume limitations. But Thailand is even though it's smaller, it has all the characteristics that China has as far as availability of people, labor, materials, tax incentives, et cetera,
And if your regional supply chain is avoid the China tariffs, right? Then that's the reason you're looking at China.
Yeah, no, you're right.
And even from a legal perspective, Thailand, Mexico, Poland are better in terms of IP protection, both because their systems are better set up to protect foreign companies, and because the companies there, I'm not sure how I can put it nicely, are just less likely to run off with your IP. One of the things I always say is that nearly all of our clients are looking to get out of China. And people say, well, that can't be. If that were the case, why aren't we seeing this massive outflux from China? And the answer is, it's just not terribly easy, particularly for a lot of companies that are themselves not truly manufacturers. And so there are countries out there that can replace China, but that doesn't mean that even all of those countries added together can replace China today. It's very difficult, and that's why we refer our clients to companies like East West, because in theory, everybody, just about everybody who sends product to the United States should be trying and even succeeding at getting their manufacturing out of China, but it's just not that easy.
And then, but that supply chain diversification, I mean, we talked earlier about Dan Harrison and Dan McLeod talked about the whole idea of supply chain diversification, getting close to your customers, getting away from that tariff, right? So that's why people are going to more of a regional supply chain. So we had another question, two more questions pop in. One said, this company sourcing out of China? It says electronics. What type of products can I not get in Mexico if I'm sourcing from China? And they're specifically electronics, but I guess you could apply that to multiple industries. Obviously, Mexico can't replace China, so what can you not get in Mexico that you can get in China? Or where is Mexico not competitive for supply chain?
Yeah, that would be I think Dan's got some examples of that, but it's available in Mexico. It just may not be as competitive. Isn't that correct, Dan?
Yeah, we've seen materials or components that not necessarily in the electronic. A lot of the electronics components still come out of South China. You get a cost advantage, and that supplier base is not widely replicated around the globe. So that change is going to happen slowly. But even more basic, machine parts, castings, for example, unless there's a relatively high labor and skilled labor component to those materials, it's still hard to replace China and some other parts of the world. And we're struggling a bit in that. We're working with some clients in Central Europe to try to replace some of that sourcing, and it's a bit challenging. We're having some success, but it's you need to get to a little higher skilled technical component of it to find competitive materials.
Do you have kind of a specific raw material example, a product example?
Well, remember we had the one, we had the one which was grills, wire grills that go into outdoor cooking products. We tried to replicate that in both Mexico and frankly in Eastern Europe, and we couldn't. It was very competitive, tough to compete against that product coming out of China because it's so as to Dan's point, it's so labor intensive and bulky. So yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So we got a couple of questions popped up. We got another one. Said okay, here it says, can I? I'm trying to read it, make sense of it. But it says basically, you've heard Chinese companies are pretty much always keeping their molds and tooling when you stop buying from. Is there anything I really can do? I don't know what industry sector this person's coming in from, but they've obviously got a situation where they have the molds and tooling in China, and they want to diversify. Is there anything they can do, or really keep the companies from just holding on to it?
Okay.
This
is Dan Harris. We deal with this issue all the time, and the reality is once a Chinese company has determined that they're going to hold on to your tooling and molds, which they very often do when you tell them that you're going to be leaving, there is usually nothing that can be done unless you already have a contract in place with them that makes clear that these are your tooling and molds, and if they fail to return them within, let's say, a week of your requesting and writing that they do so, that they owe you $200,000 in contract damages, then there's nothing we can do. But if you have something like that in your contract, then the odds are overwhelming that they will not hold on to your molds and tooling. Because a provision like that allows you to go to a Chinese court and freeze your Chinese factory's assets up to $200,000 rather quickly and rather easily. And Chinese companies know this and they fear it. So it really has to do with preparation. And so when a new client comes to us and says, you know, I'm looking to move my production out of China to, let's say, Thailand or Mexico, the first thing we ask them is, what do you have in place in China? And if they don't have a manufacturing agreement, or if their manufacturing agreement does not address issues like molds and tooling, we tell them, first thing we should do is get a contract in place without your Chinese manufacturer knowing that you're leaving, get them to sign it, get the protections in place, and then let's talk about leaving.
Great, thank you, Dan Ayers. Another question has popped in as far as the supplier identification and qualification. It says if you relocated to Mexico, Southeast Asia, Poland, are the supplier qualification process different than it would be if you're looking for suppliers in China? So I guess there's phrase another way, is there a uniqueness of Central Eastern Europe, Mexico, Southeast Asia when you're working with suppliers, both from the operational side and from the legal side?
Well, I mean, this is Mark Plum. You certainly have to, you know, Dan talked about it, that the IP situation in the other countries outside of China can sometimes be easier and be more transparent. As far as what the company does, you know, as far as their quality control and their management and how they operate as from the operational side, it's very similar. I think it's really the legal constraints that are around it that may vary by country. You have to look at it a little bit differently maybe, but as far as, are they a quality manufacturer? Do they have the ISO? Do they train their people correctly? Do they have end-of-line audits? All that kind of stuff that you would look for. That's pretty consistent across borders.
Yeah. And then last final question that popped up is around, for this company's got a procurement office. It says, what's the biggest, if I'm having to terminate employees in my chief procurement office, what is the downside risk of that? What is the risk of that for termination of employees? Dan Harris, I think that's probably for you.
I am definitely not a China employment law expert. We have a couple of them. Fred, do you want to answer this, or do you want me to answer this?
Well, let me take a stab at it first,
Okay.
and then we can work from that. Also, of course, I'm not a China labor lawyer. I'm not even really a U.S. labor lawyer. But one thing I do read extensively about the subject and talk about these issues with my colleagues who are China labor lawyers. And let's put it this way: it's a totally different world. You're dealing with labor provisions that either we haven't seen in a country like the U.S. in decades, or we might not have seen them at all. These are labor laws, but what you would expect in a country that considers itself to be a socialist country. These are in some cases rather paternalistic, very at least in principle labor friendly provisions. So when you are terminating employees, right, there's a lot of potential pitfalls in terms of how you have to go about things, what protections, what safeguards, and what compensation you have to provide. And again, not just from this perspective, but also from having worked in China for a long time and seeing how these things have to be handled. It's a real minefield. It's a real minefield, and obviously legal advice is necessary across the board, but this is one area where you certainly want to be properly advised by a Chinese labor attorney, and be very careful, right? And plan ahead for all of these contingencies. There's a good chance that it's not going to be straightforward, and make allowances for having to offer compensation packages that are not what you would want to do under normal circumstances, or at all. But that's just the way that things work in China when it comes to that. Dan, is there anything you'd like to add?
No, other than we have been handling a number of matters for companies that are shutting down their operations in China. And these are companies that have subsidiary entities in China. And that is a very difficult process as well. It involves terminating employees, but it involves a lot more than that. And really, you have two choices. One, you do what the Baltimore Colts did, and you leave in the middle of the night, and you better not ever return. Or two, you go through basically the equivalent of the Spanish Inquisition and deal with the Chinese government authorities for a year or two, claiming that you owe this or that tax that you didn't even know existed. And but you have to go through that if you plan to do business with China in the future. It's really a difficult process.
Yeah, no, we've closed a number of factories in China, and you are 100% right. It is, on the HRS piece, is a very difficult process. It is right now. We are right on schedule. We're actually 2 minutes over, so we're going to stop the webinar. We've got some additional questions we will answer, follow with you directly. I want to thank everyone for taking the time. I want to thank Dan Harris, Fred Rockport, and Dan McLeod, and Mark Plum for taking the time to answer these questions. We'll get back to you if those are outstanding questions, and we appreciate you all taking the time to attend the webinar. Thank you so much, and there'll be a recording and a recording of this webinar sent to all of those who are here today. Thank you very much, and this concludes today's webinar. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.